The locomotive screeched into Fort Bridger, Wyoming on a scorching afternoon in July 1882, and Victoria Zimmerman pressed her gloved hand against the window glass hard enough to leave an imprint, her breath catching as she glimpsed the raw frontier town that would become her prison or her salvation. The advertisement had promised a respectable rancher seeking a wife, a man of property and good standing, but the trembling in her fingers told the truth her mind refused to acknowledge. She was running toward the unknown because what lay behind was infinitely worse. Victoria gathered her few belongings with movements that betrayed her nervousness. The carpetbag clutched so tightly her knuckles showed white through the thin leather of her gloves. She was 22 years old, though the past year had aged her in ways that did not show on her unblemished face. Her dark hair was pinned severely beneath a modest bonnet, and her traveling dress, though clean and carefully mended, spoke of genteel poverty rather than prosperity. The other passengers filed past her, eager to disembark, but Victoria remained frozen in her seat until the conductor cleared his throat pointedly. "Miss, we have reached the final stop." She forced herself to stand, to walk down the narrow aisle, to descend the steep steps onto the wooden platform where the Wyoming sun hit her like a physical blow. The heat was different here, dry and unrelenting, nothing like the humid summers of Pennsylvania where she had grown up. Fort Bridger sprawled before her in a collection of weathered buildings, dusty streets, an endless sky that seemed to swallow everything beneath it. Victoria searched the sparse crowd for a face that might belong to Henry Carmichael, the rancher whose letters had been polite but distant, whose photograph had shown a stern man with calculating eyes. "Miss Zimmerman." The voice came from behind her, and Victoria turned so quickly she nearly dropped her bag. The man standing there was not Henry Carmichael. She knew this immediately, though she had never seen her intended husband in person. This man was younger, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim, a faded shirt, scuffed boots, and a hat that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that stopped her, gray-blue like storm clouds over mountains, and filled with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his rough appearance. "I am Victoria Zimmerman," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Mr. Carmichael?" Something flickered across his face, gone too quickly for her to identify. "No, madam. My name is Matthew Dawson. I work for Mr. Carmichael at the Double C Ranch. He sent me to collect you and bring you out to the property." Relief and disappointment warred within her chest. Relief that she did not yet have to face the man who would become her husband. Disappointment that this stranger with kind eyes was merely an employee sent on an errand. Victoria nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak further. Matthew Dawson reached for her carpetbag, and she relinquished it after a moment's hesitation, following him toward a wagon that waited at the end of the platform. The wagon was sturdy but plain, hitched to two horses that stood patiently in the afternoon heat. Matthew loaded her bag into the back with practiced efficiency, then turned to help her onto the bench seat. Victoria accepted his hand because she had no choice, but she pulled away the moment she was settled, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing but not unkind, and she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. "It is about an hour's ride to the ranch," Matthew said as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "The road is rough in places, but we should arrive before supper." Victoria nodded again, still not speaking. Matthew clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon lurched into motion. They rolled through Fort Bridger's Main Street, past the general store and the saloon, the livery stable and the small church with its whitewashed exterior. People stopped to stare at the newcomer, and Victoria felt their curiosity like pinpricks against her skin. She pulled her shawl tighter despite the heat, trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Once they left the town behind, the landscape opened into something vast and intimidating. Rolling plains stretched in every direction, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees near creek beds. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in summer. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip of hooves. Victoria had never experienced such emptiness, such absence of the familiar sounds of civilization. In Philadelphia, where she had spent the last 4 years working as a seamstress, there had always been noise, carriages, vendors, the constant hum of humanity pressed close together. "Have you been in Wyoming long?" Matthew asked after they had traveled perhaps 20 minutes. His voice was careful, as though he sensed her skittishness and was trying not to spook her further. "I just arrived," Victoria said, then realized he meant something different. "No, I have never been west of Pennsylvania before." "It takes some getting used to," Matthew agreed. "The space, I mean. When I first came out here 5 years ago, I thought the sky would swallow me whole." Despite herself, Victoria glanced at him. "Where did you come from?" "Missouri originally. My family had a small farm, but after my father died, there was not enough to support all of us. My brothers took over the property and I headed west to find work." He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "I have been at the Double C for 3 years now. It is a good outfit, fair wages, decent conditions." Victoria heard what he was not saying, that Henry Carmichael, her future husband, was a reasonable employer. This should have comforted her, but instead it made her stomach clench with anxiety. She twisted her hands together, feeling the calluses on her palms from years of needlework, the rough patches where thread had worn away the softness. "Miss Zimmerman," Matthew said gently, "are you all right?" "Yes," she lied automatically, the word as natural as breathing. She had spent so long pretending to be all right, maintaining the facade of composure even as her world crumbled, that she no longer knew how to answer truthfully. Matthew did not press her, but she sensed his attention shift, become more focused. They rode in silence for another stretch, the sun beating down relentlessly. Victoria's mouth grew dry, and she wished she had thought to bring water, but she was too proud to ask if there was any available. Her dress clung to her back with perspiration, and dust coated everything, her skirts, her gloves, the wisps of hair that had escaped her bonnet. "There is a canteen under the seat if you are thirsty," Matthew said, as though reading her mind. Victoria hesitated, then reached beneath the bench and found the canteen. She drank sparingly, conscious of Matthew beside her, of the strange intimacy of sharing water in this vast emptiness. When she passed the canteen to him, their fingers brushed briefly, and she jerked her hand back as though burned. Matthew took a long drink, recapped the canteen and replaced it under the seat. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more serious. "Miss Zimmerman, I want you to know that if you need anything at all, you can come to me. I work in the bunkhouse with the other hands, but I am around most days." Victoria's throat tightened. Why would you say such a thing? He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. When he did, his words were measured, chosen carefully. "Because you look like someone who needs a friend, and because Mr. Carmichael can be a difficult man." Fear spiked through her, sharp and cold despite the heat. "What do you mean?" "Nothing improper," Matthew said quickly. "He runs his ranch well, and he pays his debts. But he is set in his ways, and he expects things to be done according to his preferences. He is not a man who bends easily." Victoria absorbed this information, her heart sinking. She had known, of course, that marrying a stranger through correspondence was a risk. But she had been desperate, fleeing a situation that had become untenable after her employer's son had decided that a seamstress living alone was fair game for his unwanted attentions. When she had rejected him, he had spread rumors that cost her both her position and her reputation. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like divine intervention, a chance to start fresh where no one knew her past. "I appreciate your concern," Victoria said formally, "but I am certain everything will be fine." Matthew glanced at her, and in his eyes she saw doubt, pity, and something else she could not name. "I hope you are right, Miss Zimmerman. I truly do." They crested a rise, and the Double C Ranch spread before them in the valley below. It was larger than Victoria had imagined, with a substantial main house, a large barn, several outbuildings and corrals that held dozens of horses and cattle. The house itself was 2 stories, built from logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. It looked solid, permanent, a statement of prosperity in this untamed land. As they descended toward the ranch, Victoria's anxiety intensified until she could barely breathe. She pressed one hand to her stomach, trying to calm the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Matthew slowed the horses, and she realized he was giving her time to compose herself before they arrived. This small kindness nearly undid her, bringing tears to her eyes that she blinked away furiously. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For being kind." Matthew's expression softened. "You do not need to thank me for basic human decency, Miss Zimmerman." But she did, because in her experience, kindness was rarely freely given. It always came with expectations, with strings attached, with a price that would eventually be demanded. Still, as they rolled into the ranch yard and several men emerged from the barn to watch their arrival, Victoria found herself grateful that Matthew Dawson had been the one sent to meet her train. The front door of the house opened, and a man stepped onto the porch. Henry Carmichael looked exactly like his photograph, tall and lean, with iron-gray hair and a face that seemed carved from granite. He was perhaps 45 years old, dressed in clean but well-worn clothes that marked him as a working rancher rather than an absentee owner. He stood with his arms crossed, watching as Matthew brought the wagon to a halt. "Mr. Carmichael," Matthew said with a nod. "I have brought Miss Zimmerman as you requested." Henry Carmichael's gaze fixed on Victoria with an intensity that made her want to shrink into herself. He looked her over from head to toe, assessing her as he might assess livestock, and she felt something inside her recoil. But she forced herself to sit straight, to meet his eyes, to show no weakness. "Get down," Henry said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Let me have a look at you." Matthew climbed down first, then reached up to help Victoria. His hands were gentle as they circled her waist, lowering her carefully to the ground. She wanted to cling to him, to beg him not to leave her alone with this cold-eyed stranger, but instead she stepped away and approached the porch on unsteady legs. Henry descended the steps and circled her slowly, examining her from every angle. Victoria stood rigid, humiliation burning through her veins. Finally, he stopped in front of her and reached out to tip her chin up with his calloused fingers. "You are thinner than I expected from your description," he said, "and older than I would have preferred, but I suppose you will do. Can you cook?" "Yes, sir," Victoria managed. "So?" "Yes, sir. I worked as a seamstress for 4 years. Henry grunted, apparently satisfied. "Good. I need a woman who can earn her keep, not some useless ornament. We will be married tomorrow in town. The preacher has already been notified. Tonight you will sleep in the spare room upstairs. I expect you up before dawn to help with breakfast." Victoria's mind reeled. Tomorrow. She had thought she would have at least a few days to acclimate, to prepare herself. But Henry Carmichael was clearly not a man who saw any purpose in delay. "You understand?" Henry demanded when she did not respond immediately. "Yes, sir." "Then get your bag and go inside. My housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, will show you your room and explain your duties." He turned away dismissively, already moving toward the barn. Over his shoulder he called, "Dawson, get that wagon unloaded and the horses tended, and tell the men supper is at 6 sharp." Matthew retrieved Victoria's carpetbag and walked with her to the porch. As they climbed the steps, he leaned close and said quietly, "Remember what I told you, if you need anything." Victoria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Matthew held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw concern there and anger on her behalf, and a helplessness that mirrored her own. Then he placed her bag at her feet and walked away, his shoulders tight with tension. The front door opened to reveal a plump woman in her 50s with graying hair, and a face that might have been kind if it had not been set in lines of permanent worry. She looked Victoria over with tired eyes, then picked up the carpetbag. "I am Alina Patterson," she said. "Come with me." Victoria followed her into the house, taking in her surroundings with quick glances. The interior was clean but austere, furnished with heavy pieces that spoke of function rather than comfort. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no softness anywhere. It felt more like a barracks than a home. Mrs. Patterson led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor, down a short hallway, and into a small room that contained only a bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair. A single window looked out over the corrals. "This is your room until the wedding," Mrs. Patterson said, setting the bag on the bed. "After that, you will move into Mr. Carmichael's room." She paused, studying Victoria with an expression that might have been sympathy. "He is not a bad man, girl. He is just used to getting his own way. If you are obedient and work hard, you will get along fine." "And if I am not obedient?" Victoria asked, then immediately regretted the question. Mrs. Patterson's face closed down, becoming carefully neutral. "Then things will be difficult for you, but you strike me as a sensible girl. I am sure you will figure out how to manage." She moved toward the door. "Wash up and come down to the kitchen. I will show you where everything is kept and what will be expected of you." After Mrs. Patterson left, Victoria sank onto the edge of the bed and allowed herself one moment of pure despair. What had she done? She had traded one terrible situation for another, and now she was trapped. The wedding was tomorrow. After that, she would be bound to Henry Carmichael legally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. There would be no escape. But even as panic clawed at her throat, Victoria forced herself to breathe, to think. She had survived worse than this. After her parents died of cholera when she was 18, leaving her alone and penniless, she had made her own way in Philadelphia for 4 years. She had endured poverty, loneliness, and the constant threat of men who thought her vulnerability gave them rights to her body. She would survive this too. She had to. Victoria unpacked her few belongings, washed her face and hands in the basin, and changed into a simpler dress more suitable for work. Then she went downstairs to find the kitchen and begin learning the routines that would govern her life. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an efficient teacher, showing Victoria where supplies were stored, how Mr. Carmichael liked his meals prepared, what time breakfast was served. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse with their own cook, but Henry took his meals in the house, and he expected them on time and to his specifications. "He does not tolerate waste," Mrs. Patterson warned as they prepared supper together. "Every penny spent must be justified. And he expects quiet at meals. He does not like chatter." Victoria absorbed this information silently, her hands moving automatically through the familiar tasks of chopping vegetables, and setting the table. When Henry came in precisely at 6 o'clock, she stood by her chair until he nodded permission for her to sit. The meal was eaten in silence, with Henry occasionally issuing curt comments about the day's work or instructions for tomorrow. He did not address Victoria directly or acknowledge her presence beyond the initial nod. After supper, Victoria helped Mrs. Patterson clean up, then was dismissed to her room. She lay in the narrow bed as darkness fell, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corrals, the low murmur of men's voices from the bunkhouse. Through her window, she could see stars appearing in impossible profusion, more stars than she had ever imagined existed. She thought about Matthew Dawson's gray-blue eyes, his quiet offer of friendship, the gentle way he had helped her from the wagon. He was a stranger, and she had no reason to trust him. But something in her recognized something in him, a kindness that seemed genuine rather than calculated. It was a small comfort in a world that suddenly seemed very cold and very lonely. Sleep was long in coming, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of trains that never stopped, of running without ever reaching safety, of gray-blue eyes that watched her from shadows she could not penetrate. The next morning, Victoria was awakened before dawn by Mrs. Patterson's knock on her door. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to help with breakfast, moving through the tasks with the mechanical efficiency of exhaustion. Henry appeared, ate without comment, and announced that they would leave for town at 8 o'clock. "Wear your best dress," he instructed. "I will not have people saying I married a woman who looks like a ragpicker." Victoria's best dress was the one she had traveled in, but she put it on obediently and did what she could with her hair, pinning it into a simple style that at least looked neat if not fashionable. When she came downstairs, Henry gave her another of his assessing looks but said nothing. He led her outside to a buggy that was already hitched and waiting. As they prepared to leave, Matthew emerged from the barn leading a horse. He was apparently riding into town as well, though for what purpose Victoria did not know. When he saw her, his expression tightened, and he gave her a small nod that she returned gratefully. The ride to Fort Bridger seemed much shorter than it had the previous day, though perhaps that was because Victoria dreaded their destination. Henry spoke only once, to tell her that after the wedding they would visit the general store to purchase fabric for new dresses, as he expected his wife to be properly clothed. "You will make your own clothes, of course," he added. "I am not paying some seamstress when you have the skills yourself." "Of course," Victoria echoed numbly. The church was even smaller than she had remembered, a single room with rough wooden pews and a simple altar. The preacher was an elderly man with gentle eyes who looked at Victoria with concern when he saw how pale she was. "Are you certain about this, child?" he asked quietly while Henry was outside tending to the horse. Victoria wanted to scream no, wanted to beg him to help her escape, wanted to collapse on the floor and refuse to move. Instead, she said, "Yes, Reverend, I am certain." She was not certain at all, but what choice did she have? She had no money, no family, nowhere to go. If she fled, she would end up destitute, possibly dead in this harsh land where survival required resources she did not possess. Henry returned, and the ceremony began. Victoria spoke her vows in a voice that did not sound like her own, feeling as though she was watching herself from a great distance. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Henry kissed her briefly, perfunctorily, she felt nothing but a dull acceptance of her fate. They signed the registry, and then they were married. Victoria Zimmerman had become Victoria Carmichael, though she felt no different except perhaps more trapped. Henry seemed satisfied, shaking the preacher's hand and paying him from a roll of bills he kept in his pocket. As they exited the church, Victoria saw Matthew standing near the general store, watching. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and she saw in his face what she could not allow herself to feel: grief for the loss of possibilities, anger at injustice, resignation to the way things were. Then Henry's hand clamped around her elbow, steering her toward the store, and the moment was broken. The purchase of fabric took longer than Victoria expected. As Henry examined every bolt carefully, questioned every price, and negotiated ruthlessly over quantities and quality. Finally, he settled on several lengths of serviceable cotton in subdued colors and a single piece of wool for winter. Victoria would have preferred brighter shades, but she knew better than to voice her opinion. As they loaded their purchases into the buggy, Matthew approached leading his horse. "Congratulations on your wedding," he said to Henry, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you, Dawson," Henry replied. "Did you pick up that order from the farrier?" "Yes, sir. Everything is loaded on my saddle." "Good. We will head back then." The ride to the ranch was silent. Victoria sat beside her new husband, her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape roll past without really seeing it. Everything felt unreal, as though she had stepped into someone else's life. She kept expecting to wake up, to find herself back in Philadelphia, discovering this had all been a terrible nightmare. But when they arrived at the Double C, and Henry told her to take her parcels upstairs and move her belongings into his room, reality crashed down on her with crushing weight. His room, his bed, his wife. Victoria carried her carpetbag and the fabric up to the master bedroom, which was larger than the small room she had occupied the previous night but no more welcoming. The furniture was heavy and dark, the bed covered with a plain quilt that had seen better days. There was a wardrobe for clothes, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. No mirror, no decoration, nothing to suggest comfort or beauty. She unpacked mechanically, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe beside Henry's shirts and trousers, setting her hairbrush and pins on the washstand. Her entire life fit into one half of one shelf. The thought should have been depressing, but she was too numb to feel much of anything. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Carmichael wants his dinner at noon," she said. "And he said to tell you that he expects you in his bed tonight after supper." Those were his exact words. Victoria's face burned with humiliation, but she nodded. Mrs. Patterson lingered for a moment, then said quietly, "It gets easier, girl. The first time is the hardest, but then it becomes just another duty, like any other." This was meant to be comforting, Victoria supposed, but it only made her feel more desolate. She went downstairs to help with dinner preparations, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Henry came in precisely at noon, ate with his usual silent efficiency, and returned to his work without comment. The afternoon passed in a haze of chores. Victoria helped Mrs. Patterson with laundry, mending, and preparations for supper. The housekeeper showed her how Henry liked his shirts ironed, how he preferred his socks folded, the particular way he wanted his coffee prepared. Every detail mattered. Every preference had to be remembered and honored. "You must understand, Mrs. Patterson said as they worked, Mr. Carmichael had a wife before you. She died 3 years ago giving birth to their first child. The baby died too. He does not talk about it, but he was different after that, harder, more closed off." This information shifted something in Victoria's understanding. Henry's coldness was not merely temperament but armor against grief. She could not decide if this made her feel better or worse about her situation. As the day wore toward evening, Victoria's anxiety mounted. She knew what was coming, knew what would be expected of her. Her mother had died before she could explain such things, and Victoria's knowledge came from whispered conversations with other girls, from observations of the world around her. She knew it would hurt, knew she was expected to submit, knew her own desires or fears were irrelevant. Supper was another silent affair. Afterward, Henry stood and announced, "I am going to check on some things in the barn. I will be up in an hour." Victoria helped Mrs. Patterson clean the kitchen, then climbed the stairs to the master bedroom with leaden feet. She changed into her nightgown with shaking hands, then sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, both too fast and too slow. When Henry entered the room, he closed the door firmly behind him and began unbuttoning his shirt. Victoria kept her eyes down, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Get in the bed," Henry ordered. She obeyed, sliding beneath the quilt and lying rigid as a board. Henry finished undressing and joined her, his body heavy as he rolled toward her. His hands were rough, impersonal, pushing up her nightgown with businesslike efficiency. There was no tenderness, no consideration for her fear or discomfort. When he entered her, the pain was sharp and immediate, and Victoria bit her lip hard to keep from crying out. It was over quickly, at least. Henry finished with a grunt, rolled away, and within minutes was snoring. Victoria lay awake in the darkness, tears sliding silently down her temples into her hair, her body aching, her spirit crushed. This was her life now. This was what she had agreed to when she spoke those vows. Outside the window, stars wheeled across the infinite sky, indifferent to human suffering. The days that followed fell into a brutal routine. Victoria rose before dawn to help with breakfast, spent her days cooking and cleaning and mending, and endured her nights in Henry's bed. He used her body whenever he wished, sometimes nightly, sometimes skipping a few days if he was particularly tired or busy. There was never any affection, never any attempt to make the act pleasant for her. She was a convenience, a tool for satisfying his needs and potentially bearing his children. Victoria spoke as little as possible, moving through the house like a ghost. Mrs. Patterson showed her occasional kindness, but maintained a professional distance, as though getting too close to Victoria's misery might contaminate her. The ranch hands tipped their hats when they saw her, but kept their eyes averted, uncomfortable with her obvious unhappiness. Except for Matthew Dawson. Matthew made a point of being visible, of acknowledging her existence, of treating her like a person rather than an object. When she hung laundry in the yard, he would ride past and nod good morning. When she carried water from the well, he would materialize to help with the heavy buckets. When Henry barked orders at her in front of the other men, Matthew's jaw would tighten with suppressed anger. At first, Victoria avoided him, afraid that Henry would interpret any interaction as impropriety. But Matthew was careful, never overstepping, never giving Henry cause for suspicion. And gradually, Victoria found herself watching for him, grateful for his presence, comforted by the knowledge that someone saw her suffering and cared. 3 weeks after her wedding, Victoria was in the garden behind the house, attempting to weed the neglected vegetable patch that Mrs. Patterson had pointed out needed attention. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she had pushed back her sleeves and removed her bonnet, too hot and too defeated to care about propriety. Her hands were dirty, her dress streaked with soil, and sweat dampened her hairline. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Matthew approaching, carrying 2 tin cups. He offered her one and she took it automatically, too thirsty to refuse. The water was cool and sweet, drawn fresh from the well. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You have been out here for 3 hours," Matthew said quietly. "You need to rest before you make yourself sick. Mr. Carmichael expects the garden to be productive. Mr. Carmichael expects a lot of things. Matthew crouched beside her, studying the rows she had cleared. You are doing good work here, but you cannot do it all in one day. Victoria set down the cup and returned to pulling weeds, her movements jerky with frustration. I have to. If I do not complete my tasks, he becomes angry. Does he hurt you? The question was blunt, and Victoria's hand stilled. She could not look at Matthew, could not bear to see pity in his eyes. Not the way you mean. He is not violent, but his displeasure is punishment enough. Matthew was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "This is not right, Victoria. The way he treats you, you deserve better than this." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it brought tears to her eyes. I made my choice when I answered his advertisement. I have no right to complain now. You had no real choice, Matthew countered, his voice tight with anger. You were desperate, and he took advantage of that. He wanted a servant, not a wife. What difference does it make? Victoria's voice broke, and she pressed her hands over her face, unable to hold back the sobs any longer. I am trapped here. I have nowhere to go, no money, no options. This is my life now. She expected Matthew to leave, uncomfortable with her emotional display. Instead, she felt his hand settle gently on her shoulder, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. The kindness undid her completely, and she wept as she had not allowed herself to weep since arriving at the Double C. When the storm finally passed, Victoria lowered her hands and found Matthew still crouched beside her, his expression filled with a compassion that made her chest ache. I meant what I told you that first day, he said softly. If you need anything, I am here. Even if it is just someone to talk to, someone who sees you as a person rather than property. Why? Victoria whispered. Why would you involve yourself in my troubles? You could lose your position if Mr. Carmichael thought you were interfering with his wife. Matthew's jaw tightened. Because it is the right thing to do. Because you are suffering, and I cannot stand by and watch without offering what help I can. He paused, then added quietly, and because from the moment I met you at that train station, I have thought you were the bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Victoria's breath caught. She stared at Matthew, seeing for the first time the depth of feeling in his eyes, understanding that his kindness was not merely Christian charity, but something more personal, more dangerous. She should have been scandalized, should have ordered him to leave immediately. Instead, she felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a tiny spark of hope in the darkness that had consumed her. You should not say such things, she managed. I know, but they are true nonetheless. Matthew stood, stepping back to create a proper distance between them. I will not presume on your position or make your life more difficult, Victoria. But I want you to know that you are not alone. And if you ever need help, really need it, I will do whatever is in my power to provide it. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving Victoria kneeling in the dirt with her heart pounding and her mind reeling. She returned to her weeding with automatic movements, but her thoughts were miles away, circling around Matthew's words, around the implications of what he had revealed. She should have been horrified. She was a married woman, and Matthew's declaration was entirely inappropriate. But she could not summon the outrage she knew she should feel. Instead, she felt seen, valued, for the first time since she had stepped off that train. Matthew looked at her and saw Victoria, not just Mr. Carmichael's wife, not just a servant to be ordered around. He saw her. That night, when Henry used her body with his usual mechanical efficiency, Victoria closed her eyes and thought about gray-blue eyes that held kindness, about a voice that spoke to her with respect, about hands that had touched her shoulder with gentleness rather than possession. She knew it was wrong, knew she was betraying her vows even in thought, but in her mind she held tight to the knowledge that somewhere on this ranch, Someone cared about her welfare. It was enough to make the darkness slightly less oppressive. The weeks turned into months. Summer's heat gave way to autumn's crisp mornings and shorter days. The ranch work intensified as cattle were prepared for market, supplies laid in for winter, repairs made to buildings before the weather turned. Henry drove everyone hard, including Victoria, whose days became even longer as she took on preserving vegetables, mending winter clothes, and preparing the house for cold months ahead. Matthew remained a quiet presence in her life. They rarely spoke directly, as Henry had become more watchful, more possessive. But Victoria knew Matthew was there, watching out for her in small ways. When firewood needed to be chopped, he made sure the stack by the kitchen door was always full. When her laundry basket was too heavy, she would find it mysteriously lighter, as though someone had removed half the load. When Henry was particularly harsh with her in front of the men, Matthew would find a reason to stop by the kitchen later, his presence alone a reminder that she was not invisible. Victoria began to live for these small moments of connection. A brief exchange when she brought water to the men working in the corrals. A shared glance across the yard when Henry was being unreasonable. The sight of Matthew riding in from the range, sitting tall in the saddle, his face weathered by sun and wind. She knew her feelings were developing into something dangerous, something that could destroy what little security she had. But she could not stop her heart from lifting when she saw him, could not prevent the warmth that spread through her when he smiled. In early October, a storm blew in from the mountains, bringing the first snow of the season. It was not a heavy storm, but enough to blanket the ranch in white and send temperatures plummeting. Henry had taken several men to move cattle to lower pastures, planning to be gone for 3 days. Victoria had been relieved when he announced the trip, grateful for a few nights of peace, of sleeping alone without fear of his hands reaching for her. On the second day of Henry's absence, Victoria was carrying firewood into the house when she slipped on the icy porch steps. She fell hard, the wood scattering around her, her ankle twisting painfully beneath her. She cried out before she could stop herself, then bit her lip hard, not wanting to seem weak. Within seconds, Matthew appeared from the direction of the barn, running toward her with alarm written on his face. "Victoria, are you hurt?" "My ankle," she gasped, trying to stand and immediately collapsing as pain shot up her leg. Matthew did not hesitate. He scooped her into his arms as though she weighed nothing, carrying her into the house and settling her carefully on a chair by the kitchen fire. "Mrs. Patterson hurried over, clucking with concern as Matthew knelt and gently probed Victoria's ankle through her boot. "It needs to come off so I can see how bad it is," he said. "This might hurt." Victoria nodded, gripping the arms of the chair. Matthew unlaced her boot with careful fingers and eased it off along with her stocking. Her ankle was already beginning to swell, and when Matthew pressed gently around the joint, Victoria could not suppress a gasp. "I do not think it is broken," Matthew said, "but it is a bad sprain. You need to stay off it for several days." "I cannot," Victoria protested. "There is too much work to do." "The work can wait," Matthew said firmly. He looked up at Mrs. Patterson. "Can you manage without her for a few days?" "Of course," the housekeeper said. "You get her upstairs to bed, and I will bring up some cloths to wrap that ankle, and maybe some willow bark tea for the pain." Matthew lifted Victoria again, and she was too overwhelmed by pain and shock to protest as he carried her up the stairs to the master bedroom. He laid her on the bed with surprising gentleness, propping her injured ankle on a pillow. "Thank you," Victoria whispered, looking up at him. In the dim light of the bedroom, with snow falling softly outside the window, the moment felt strangely intimate, removed from the normal rules and boundaries of their world. Matthew gazed down at her, his hand still resting on the quilt near her leg. "I wish I could do more. I wish I could take you away from here, give you the life you deserve." Victoria's breath caught. "Matthew, you cannot say such things." "I know, but they are true." He straightened, stepping back. "I should go. Mrs. Patterson will take care of you." But he lingered for another moment, his eyes holding hers, and Victoria saw in his face everything she felt but could not say: longing, frustration, tenderness, resignation. Then he turned and left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Mrs. Patterson came up with supplies and helped Victoria change into her nightgown, wrapped her ankle tightly, and gave her tea that tasted bitter but began to ease the throbbing pain. Then Victoria was left alone with her thoughts and the silent testimony of her body that even in this small crisis, it was Matthew she had reached for, Matthew who had come running, Matthew whose arms had felt like safety. That night, Victoria dreamed of running through snow-covered plains, of strong arms catching her when she fell, of gray-blue eyes that promised shelter from the storm. When she woke, tears dampened her pillow, and she did not know if they were from grief or longing or both. Henry returned the next day, irritated to find his wife incapacitated. He stood at the foot of the bed, scowling down at her swollen ankle. "How long until you can walk?" he demanded. "A few more days, I think," Victoria said quietly. "You will need to be more careful. I cannot afford to have you laid up when there is work to be done." He paused, then added, "Dawson told me he carried you upstairs. That was proper of him, I suppose, though I do not like other men handling my wife." Victoria's stomach clenched with fear. "I fell, Henry. I could not walk." He was simply helping. "See that it does not happen again. I will not have people gossiping about impropriety in my household." There was no impropriety. Henry studied her with cold eyes, and Victoria forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. Finally, he grunted and turned away. "I expect you back on your feet soon. Mrs. Patterson is not young, and she cannot do everything herself." After he left, Victoria pressed her hands over her face, trying to slow her racing heart. Henry was suspicious, and rightfully so. She needed to be more careful, needed to create distance between herself and Matthew before her feelings became obvious to everyone. It did not matter that nothing improper had actually occurred. Her thoughts alone were betrayal enough. But even as she resolved to protect herself by avoiding Matthew, her heart rebelled. Those small moments of connection were all that made her existence bearable. Without them, she would be entirely alone in her misery. Surely she could maintain a careful friendship without crossing into true infidelity. Surely she was strong enough to keep her emotions in check. Victoria's ankle healed slowly. She returned to work before she was truly ready, limping through her duties, driven by Henry's impatience and her own fear of seeming lazy. The early snow melted, but more storms followed, and soon winter settled over Wyoming with brutal intensity. Life on the ranch became a matter of pure survival. The men worked constantly to keep animals fed and alive, to prevent pipes from freezing, to maintain buildings against winds that howled down from the mountains. Victoria's days were consumed with cooking vast quantities of food, mending clothes that wore out at alarming rates, trying to keep the house warm with inadequate firewood. Henry's moods darkened with the weather. He snapped at everyone, drove the men relentlessly, and took his frustrations out on Victoria in the privacy of their bedroom. She bore his rough handling in silence, learning to distance herself mentally from what was happening to her body, floating somewhere above the bed while Henry grunted and thrust. During a blizzard in late November, the men were all trapped in the bunkhouse for 3 days, unable to reach the barn or the main house. Victoria and Mrs. Patterson huddled in the kitchen, keeping the fire burning, rationing their food supplies, listening to the wind scream like a living thing. Henry prowled the house like a caged animal, furious at his helplessness, taking his anger out in cutting words and harsh demands. On the second night, he summoned Victoria to their room earlier than usual. He had been drinking whiskey, and his eyes were hard when she entered. "You are useless," he said without preamble. "We have been married 4 months, and you still have not quickened with child. What good is a wife who cannot even fulfill her most basic purpose?" Victoria's hands clenched at her sides. "That is not within my control, Henry. Is it not? Or perhaps you are doing something to prevent it. Perhaps you do not want to bear my children. That is not true. Then why?" He advanced on her, and she forced herself not to back away. "My first wife was pregnant within 6 weeks of our marriage. She understood her duty." "I cannot control such things," Victoria repeated, her voice shaking. "I have done nothing to prevent pregnancy." Henry's hand shot out and gripped her chin, forcing her face up. "You had better not be lying to me. Because if I discover you have been taking herbs or doing anything else to thwart me, you will regret it. I am not lying." He stared at her for a long moment, then shoved her toward the bed. "Get undressed. Maybe if I am more vigorous, we will have better results." That night was worse than usual, more brutal, as though Henry was trying to punish her body into compliance. Victoria endured it with her eyes closed and her mind far away, thinking of snow falling in moonlight, of hands that touched with gentleness, of eyes that saw her as something precious rather than merely useful. When it was finally over and Henry slept, Victoria lay awake and allowed herself to admit the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Matthew Dawson. Perhaps she had been since that first day at the train station, when he had looked at her with such kindness. Perhaps it had been inevitable from the moment she stepped into this nightmare of a marriage and found him there, a point of light in unrelenting darkness. It was wrong. It was foolish. It could only lead to heartbreak. But her feelings existed regardless of propriety or wisdom, growing stronger with each passing day despite her efforts to contain them. Victoria pressed her hand against her mouth to muffle the sob that tried to escape. She could not act on these feelings, could never speak them aloud. But she could not seem to stop feeling them either. And so she was trapped, not just in a loveless marriage, but in a hopeless longing for something she could never have. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, and the men emerged from the bunkhouse to dig out paths and tend to animals. Several cattle had died, frozen in drifts or starved because they could not reach food. Henry was in a black mood, calculating his losses, driving everyone harder to make up for the setback. Victoria was hanging laundry in the brief afternoon sunshine, trying to take advantage of a break in the weather, when Matthew appeared at her side. He took the heavy wet sheet from her hands and pinned it to the line himself. "You look exhausted," he said quietly. "We are all exhausted." "That is not what I meant." Matthew secured the sheet, then turned to face her. "Victoria, has he hurt you?" She could not meet his eyes. "I am fine." "You are not fine. I can see it in your face, in the way you move. If he is harming you, there are things we can do. I could help you leave, get you somewhere safe." "And go where?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "With what money? In what capacity? Henry would hunt me down as a runaway wife, or I would starve within a week. There is no escape, Matthew. There never was." Matthew's hands clenched into fists. "I have some money saved. Not much, but enough to get you on a train east. You could go back to Philadelphia, find work again." "I cannot go back there. And I will not ruin you by accepting help that could cost you your position and your reputation." Victoria finally looked up at him, and her voice softened. "I appreciate your concern, truly I do, But this is my burden to bear. It does not have to be. Yes, it does. I made vows before God. I cannot simply walk away because my husband is cold and demanding. Many women have worse marriages. That does not make yours acceptable. Victoria reached out without thinking and touched Matthew's arm just briefly. Please, do not make this harder than it already is. Matthew covered her hand with his, just for a second, his calloused palm warm against her cold fingers. Then they both stepped back, aware of eyes that might be watching, of boundaries they could not cross. If you change your mind, Matthew said, the offer stands, always. He walked away, and Victoria returned to her laundry with tears freezing on her cheeks. Winter dragged on with brutal slowness. Christmas came and went with barely any acknowledgement beyond a slightly larger meal. Henry gave Victoria no gift, and she had nothing to give him. The new year of 1883 arrived without fanfare, just another day of endless work and bitter cold. In late January, Victoria realized her monthly courses were late. At first, she thought it was just the stress and harsh conditions affecting her body. But as 1 week became 2 and then 3, she understood what had happened. She was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with complicated emotions. Relief that Henry would no longer berate her for failing to conceive. Fear of what pregnancy and childbirth would mean in this isolated place. Grief that the child she carried would tie her to Henry forever. And beneath it all, a fierce protectiveness toward this tiny life growing inside her. This innocent who deserved better than to be born into such a cold and loveless home. She waited until she was 2 months along and certain before telling Henry. He received the news with grim satisfaction, nodding as though she had finally completed a task adequately. Good. You will continue your duties as long as you are able. My first wife worked up until the day she went into labor. I expect no less from you. Victoria bit back the response that his first wife had died in childbirth. Instead, she said quietly, "Yes, Henry." The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Victoria battled constant nausea, exhaustion that went bone deep, and a strange lightheadedness that sometimes made her sway when she stood too quickly. But Henry's expectations did not change, and so she pushed through, forcing her body to keep working even when every fiber screamed for rest. Matthew noticed immediately, of course. She saw the concern in his eyes when he watched her struggle with heavy loads, saw his jaw tighten when Henry ordered her to complete tasks that were clearly too demanding in her condition. But there was nothing he could do without overstepping, without making things worse for both of them. In early March, Victoria was drawing water from the well when a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her. She swayed, the bucket slipping from her hands, and would have fallen if Matthew had not caught her. He appeared from nowhere, his arms steadying her, his face tight with worry. "I am fine," she said automatically. "No, you are not. When did you last eat?" Victoria tried to think. "Breakfast, I suppose. That was 7 hours ago." Matthew guided her to sit on the edge of the well. "Wait here." He disappeared into the bunkhouse and returned with a piece of bread and some dried beef. "Eat this. Right now." Victoria obeyed, too tired to argue. The food helped, settling her stomach and clearing some of the fog from her mind. Matthew crouched beside her, watching to make sure she finished every bite. "You cannot keep going like this," he said when she was done. "You are pregnant and working yourself into the ground. It is not good for you or the baby. Henry expects me to maintain my duties. Henry is a fool if he cannot see he is endangering his own child by demanding too much from you." Matthew's voice was low and fierce. "Victoria, please, talk to Mrs. Patterson. Ask her to intercede with Henry to make him understand you need rest. Mrs. Patterson will not contradict Henry. No one will." Matthew was silent for a moment, then said, "I will talk to him." "No." Victoria grabbed his arm in alarm. "Matthew, you cannot. He will dismiss you or worse. Please, promise me you will not do anything foolish." Matthew looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. In his eyes, she saw a struggle between his desire to protect her and his understanding of the impossible position they were both in. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I promise. But if things get worse, if he pushes you too far, I will intervene regardless of the consequences. I cannot stand by and watch you come to harm." "You have to," Victoria whispered. "There is no other choice." She released his arm and stood, still unsteady but determined to return to work before anyone noticed her absence. Matthew watched her walk away, and Victoria felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, protective and tender and utterly heartbreaking. That night, Victoria ventured something she had never attempted before. When Henry came to bed, she said quietly, "I need to ask you something." He looked at her with surprise. She almost never initiated conversation. "What is it?" "The pregnancy has been difficult. I am having trouble keeping up with all my duties. Would it be possible to lighten my load somewhat, just until after the baby comes?" Henry's expression hardened. "You think you deserve special treatment because you are doing what any woman should be able to do without complaint. I am not asking to stop working, just to reduce the heaviest tasks. I do not want to endanger the child. The child will be fine if you simply do your job without whining about it. My first wife never complained. She understood what was expected of her." "Your first wife died," Victoria said before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was terrible. Henry's face went dark with rage, and for a moment Victoria thought he might strike her. Instead, he said in a voice like ice, "Get out of my sight. Go sleep in the spare room. I do not want to look at you right now." Victoria fled, grateful for the reprieve even if it came at the cost of Henry's anger. She curled up in the narrow bed of the spare room, her hands pressed protectively over her still flat stomach, and cried silently into the pillow. She had made things worse. Henry would punish her for her insolence, would make her life even more difficult. But a small, defiant part of her felt satisfaction that she had finally spoken truth to him, had finally pushed back even in this small way. Over the following weeks, Henry's punishment took the form of cold silence and increased demands. He barely spoke to her except to issue orders, and he added new tasks to her already overwhelming load. Victoria felt herself growing more fragile, stretched too thin, ready to break. And through it all, Matthew watched. He could not intervene directly, but he found ways to help. Wood appeared chopped before she needed to do it herself. Water buckets were mysteriously half full rather than empty when she went to the well. When she stumbled on the porch stairs, he happened to be nearby to catch her before she fell. These small acts of kindness sustained Victoria through the darkest days. She and Matthew rarely spoke directly, but they communicated through glances, through the language of presence and protection that developed between them. Victoria knew it was dangerous, knew that her feelings for Matthew were deepening into something that could destroy them both. But she could not seem to stop needing him, depending on him, loving him. Spring finally arrived in late April, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Wildflowers bloomed across the plains. New calves appeared in the fields, and the air softened into something almost gentle. Victoria's pregnancy began to show, her belly rounding beneath her dresses, and she felt the baby move for the first time one morning while kneading bread. The sensation filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. This life growing inside her was real, would soon be a person who depended entirely on her. She had to protect this child, had to find the strength to survive not just for herself, but for this innocent who had no choice about the circumstances of their birth. One evening in early May, Victoria was in the garden planting seeds when she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Matthew standing there, his hat in his hands, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. Victoria's heart stuttered. "What is it?" "I have been offered a position on a ranch in Montana. Better pay, a chance to eventually become foreman. It is an opportunity I cannot afford to turn down." The world seemed to tilt beneath Victoria's feet. Matthew was leaving. Her one source of comfort, of kindness, of hope was abandoning her to this cold existence. She knew she had no right to object, knew she should be happy for his advancement. But the words that came out were, "When do you leave?" "2 weeks. I told Henry this morning." Matthew stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Come with me, Victoria." "What?" "Come with me. Leave Henry, leave this place. We can go to Montana together, start fresh where no one knows us. I will take care of you and the baby. I will give you the life you deserve." Victoria stared at him, her mind reeling. He was offering her everything she wanted and nothing she could have. "Matthew, I cannot. I am married. The child I carry is Henry's. The child you carry deserves a father who will love them, who will love their mother, not a man who treats you like property." Matthew's voice was urgent, passionate. "I know what I am asking is wrong by every law and convention. But Victoria, I love you. I have loved you since the moment I saw you step off that train. And I cannot leave here knowing I abandoned you to a life of misery when I could have saved you." Tears streamed down Victoria's face. "You love me with everything I am. I know you are married, know I have no right to these feelings, but they exist regardless, and I believe you feel the same way about me." Victoria wanted to deny it, to protect them both by lying, but she could not. "I do," she whispered. "I love you too, but Matthew, we cannot do this. If I run away with you, Henry will come after us. He will not accept the humiliation of a runaway wife. And even if we escaped him, we would be living in sin, outcast from decent society. The baby would be born a bastard, even though legally they are Henry's legitimate child. I do not care about society, but I do, not for myself but for the child. They deserve a name, a place in the world. I cannot take that from them just because I am selfish enough to want happiness for myself." Matthew's face was anguished. "So you are choosing to stay here, to continue suffering?" "I am choosing to protect my child. It is what a mother does." Victoria's voice broke. "Please do not ask me to be selfish. Please do not make this harder than it already is." Matthew stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat of his body, could see flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes. "If I thought you were truly choosing this, I would accept it. But Victoria, you are not choosing. You are capitulating to circumstances beyond your control. There is a difference." "Perhaps, but the outcome is the same. I cannot go with you, Matthew, no matter how much I might want to." They stood in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains, so close and yet impossibly far apart. Victoria memorized every detail of Matthew's face, knowing these might be the last moments she would ever spend with him. The ache in her chest was physical, as though her heart was being torn in two. Finally, Matthew reached out and gently touched her cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb. It was the first time he had touched her face, and the intimacy of it nearly broke her. "I will not give up on you," he said quietly. "I will go to Montana and take this position because I need to build something stable, something that could support a family, but I will write to you. And if you ever change your mind, if you ever decide you want to leave, send word and I will come for you. I do not care if it takes months or years. I will wait until you are ready to trust me with your future. Matthew, you should not wait for me. You should find someone free to love you. I do not want anyone else, I want you." He dropped his hand and stepped back, creating proper distance between them once more. 2 weeks, Victoria. Think about it. You do not have to decide right now. He turned and walked away, leaving Victoria alone in the garden with her hands pressed over her mouth and her heart in pieces. She sank to her knees among the newly planted seeds and wept until she had no tears left. The next 2 weeks were agony. Victoria moved through her days like a woman in a dream, torn between duty and desire, between what she should do and what she wanted desperately to do. She watched Matthew preparing for his departure, packing his belongings, saying farewell to the other ranch hands. Every moment that passed brought her closer to losing him forever. Henry noticed her distraction and attributed it to pregnancy, dismissing her mood with his usual indifference. Mrs. Patterson offered quiet sympathy, assuming Victoria was simply tired and overwhelmed. No one suspected the truth, that she was wrestling with the most important decision of her life. Matthew made good on his promise not to pressure her. He maintained a respectful distance, did not seek her out privately, gave her space to think. But sometimes Victoria would look up from her work, to find him watching her with such longing in his eyes that she had to turn away before she did something foolish. 3 days before Matthew's scheduled departure, Victoria was folding laundry in her bedroom when she found a small envelope tucked between the sheets. She recognized Matthew's handwriting immediately, though she had never seen it before. With shaking hands, she opened the envelope and pulled out a single piece of paper. The letter was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. Matthew had written down everything he felt, everything he had been holding back out of respect for her position. He described how he had fallen in love with her courage in the face of hardship, her quiet strength, the way she endured suffering without losing her essential humanity. He painted a picture of the life they could have together, the home he would build for her, the way he would cherish both her and the child she carried. He did not demand or plead, but simply laid his heart bare and left the choice in her hands. At the end, he had written, "I will be leaving on the morning stage. If you want to come with me, meet me at the crossroads 2 miles south of the ranch at dawn. If you do not come, I will understand and will never trouble you again. But know that my offer stands for as long as I draw breath. Whenever you are ready, I will be waiting. I love you, Victoria. That will never change." Victoria read the letter 3 times, then carefully tucked it inside her dress, next to her heart. She went about her duties for the rest of the day with mechanical efficiency, her mind far away, calculating possibilities and consequences. That night, Henry used her body with his usual roughness, made worse by the awkwardness of her pregnant belly. Afterward, as he snored beside her, Victoria stared at the ceiling and faced the truth she had been avoiding. She was dying here. Not physically, though the pregnancy was taking a toll on her health. But her spirit was slowly being crushed, ground down by endless days of loveless work and joyless existence. If she stayed, she would become a ghost, a hollow shell moving through the motions of life without truly living. And what kind of mother would she be to her child if she was spiritually dead? Henry would never change. He would never see her as anything more than a servant and a vessel for his children. The baby would grow up in a house without warmth, without laughter, without love. And eventually, Henry would break the child's spirit too, molding them into the same cold, unfeeling person he had become. But if she went with Matthew, she was choosing scandal and hardship. She would be branded an adulteress, a runaway wife, a woman without morals or decency. The child would carry the stigma of their mother's choices, would face whispers and judgment wherever they went. Victoria pressed her hands over her belly, feeling the small movements of the life growing within her. "I am sorry," she whispered to the baby. I am sorry that the choice is between two difficult paths. But I promise you this, whichever road I choose, I will love you fiercely and protect you with everything I have. You will know what it means to be cherished, even if the world judges us." The baby kicked against her palm, and Victoria took it as a sign. She could not live without love, could not raise a child in this emotional wasteland and expect them to thrive. She had to be brave enough to choose happiness, even if it came at a terrible cost. Victoria slipped out of bed before dawn, moving silently so as not to wake Henry. She dressed in her warmest clothes, packed a small bag with essentials, and retrieved the money she had been secretly hoarding from the household accounts. It was not much, just a few dollars she had skimmed by being careful with groceries and supplies, but it was something. She left no note, no explanation. What could she say that Henry would understand or accept? She was abandoning her vows, breaking laws both legal and moral, choosing her own desires over duty. There were no words that could justify or excuse her actions. Victoria crept down the stairs and out the back door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the entire ranch. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, turning from black to deep blue. She hurried across the yard and down the road, walking as quickly as her pregnant body would allow. The crossroads were 2 miles away, and Victoria covered the distance in what felt like both minutes and hours. Every step took her further from safety and deeper into the unknown. She kept expecting to hear Henry's voice behind her, or the sound of hoofbeats as he came after her. But there was only silence and the sound of her own labored breathing. She reached the crossroads just as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. And there, waiting exactly where he had promised to be, was Matthew Dawson. He sat on his horse with a pack horse beside him, his belongings strapped securely. When he saw Victoria approaching, his face transformed with such joy and relief that she started to cry. Matthew dismounted and ran to meet her, catching her in his arms as she stumbled the last few steps. "You came," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was so afraid you would not come." "I almost did not," Victoria admitted, clinging to him. "I am still not certain this is right, but I cannot stay there anymore, Matthew. I cannot live without love. You will never have to." Matthew pulled back just enough to look at her face, his hands cradling her cheeks. "I swear to you, Victoria, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice. I will be the husband Henry should have been, the father your child deserves." Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the cold, perfunctory kisses Henry had given her. Matthew kissed her as though she was precious, as though he was receiving a gift beyond price. Victoria had never been kissed with tenderness before, had never experienced desire that was about giving pleasure rather than taking it. The kiss was gentle and reverent and full of promise, and when it ended, Victoria was crying harder than before. "We need to go," Matthew said gently. "The stage leaves Fort Bridger in an hour and we need to be on it." He helped her onto the pack horse, then mounted his own horse. They rode toward town as quickly as Victoria's condition allowed, the sun rising higher with each passing minute. Victoria kept glancing back, expecting to see Henry and his men pursuing them. But the road remained empty behind them. They reached Fort Bridger with 20 minutes to spare. Matthew bought 2 tickets on the northbound stage while Victoria waited, trying to make herself inconspicuous. Several people stared at her, and she knew gossip would spread quickly once Henry discovered her gone. But by then, she would be miles away, beyond his immediate reach. The stage arrived, and Matthew helped her inside. They took seats in the back, and Victoria pressed close to him, needing his strength and warmth. As the stage lurched into motion, carrying them away from Fort Bridger and toward an uncertain future. Victoria felt terror and exhilaration in equal measure. "You think he will come after us?" she asked quietly. "Probably," Matthew said honestly. "But Wyoming is a big territory, and Montana is even bigger. If we are careful, if we establish ourselves quickly under new names, we can disappear. Plenty of people come west to reinvent themselves. We will just be two more among thousands." Victoria nodded, trying to draw comfort from his confidence. She rested her head on his shoulder, and Matthew wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Outside the stage windows, the Wyoming landscape rolled past, vast and empty and full of possibility. They changed stages in the late afternoon, heading northwest toward Montana territory. At each stop, Victoria expected someone to recognize her, to challenge Matthew, to demand they return to face consequences. But no one paid them any attention beyond normal curiosity about travelers. That night, they stopped at a small way station where the stage company provided basic lodging for passengers. There were no private rooms, just a large common area where everyone bedded down. Matthew made a pallet for Victoria in the corner, giving her what privacy he could, and stood guard while she slept fitfully. The next day brought more travel, more miles between them and Fort Bridger. Victoria felt herself beginning to relax, to believe they might actually escape. Matthew remained vigilant but optimistic, making plans for their arrival in Montana, describing the ranch where he would be working. "The owner is a good man," Matthew told her as they rattled along. "Fair and decent. He has a large spread with room for families. They have a small cabin available for married couples. I asked about it when I accepted the position." "But we are not married," Victoria said quietly. "We will be as soon as it is safe to arrange it, once you are no longer legally bound to Henry." Matthew took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "It will take time to establish grounds for annulment or divorce, but we will find a way. In the meantime, we will present ourselves as husband and wife. No one needs to know otherwise." Victoria nodded, understanding the necessity of the deception. In frontier communities, questions about the past were often considered impolite. As long as they worked hard and caused no trouble, most people would accept them at face value. They reached the Montana border on the fourth day of travel. Victoria felt as though she could breathe more easily once they crossed that invisible line, putting another layer of distance between herself and Henry. Matthew seemed to relax as well, his expression lightening, his smile coming more readily. The ranch where Matthew would be working was another 2 days' journey northwest. They finally arrived in the early evening of their 6th day of travel, exhausted and dusty, but filled with cautious hope. The property was called the Rising Sun Ranch, and it sprawled across a lush valley with mountains on 3 sides and a river running through the center. The owner, a man named William Fletcher who was perhaps 50 years old, came out to greet them. He had kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He shook Matthew's hand warmly, then turned to Victoria with a respectful nod. "This must be the missus," he said. Matthew mentioned in his letter that he was recently married. "Welcome to the Rising Sun, Mrs. Dawson." The name felt strange on her ears, both wrong and right simultaneously. But Victoria smiled and said, "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I am pleased to be here. You look done in, both of you. Let me show you to your cabin and you can get settled. There will be time enough tomorrow to discuss work and responsibilities." The cabin William Fletcher led them to was small but sturdy, built from logs with a stone fireplace at one end. It consisted of a single room with a sleeping area separated by a curtain, a cooking area with a small stove, and a table with 2 chairs. It was simple and plain, but it was clean and private and theirs. After William left, Victoria stood in the center of the cabin and looked around with wonder. "This is ours. We can truly stay here, as long as I work for Mr. Fletcher, yes. This is our home, Victoria." Matthew set down their bags and came to stand before her. "I know it is not much. It is perfect," Victoria said, and she meant it. After the cold grandeur of Henry's house, where she had never felt welcome or comfortable, this tiny cabin felt like sanctuary. Here she could breathe. Here she could be herself. Matthew's eyes softened. "You are exhausted. You should rest. I will get a fire going and see about finding us some supper." But Victoria did not want to rest yet. Now that they were finally alone, truly alone, she found herself looking at Matthew with new awareness. He was not her husband, not legally. But he had rescued her from misery, had offered her love and protection, had promised to care for her and the child she carried. "Matthew," she said softly, "I want you to know how grateful I am. For everything you have done, everything you have risked. You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You gave up your position at the Double C, traveled hundreds of miles with a pregnant runaway wife, accepted responsibility for another man's child. Those are not small things." Matthew stepped closer, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. "That child is mine in every way that matters. I will love them as my own, Victoria, and I will love you for as long as you will let me." Victoria reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble against her palm, the warmth of his skin. "I love you too. I think I have since that first day, though I did not let myself acknowledge it." Matthew turned his head and kissed her palm, then pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her pregnant belly. They stood together in the fading light, holding each other, and Victoria felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember: peace. That night they lay together in the narrow bed, fully clothed, simply holding each other. Matthew was scrupulously respectful, making no demands, content simply to be close to her. Victoria nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt safer than she had in months. "I promise I will make you happy," Matthew murmured into her hair. "I will spend every day trying to deserve you." "You already deserve me," Victoria whispered back. "You are the best man I have ever known." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Victoria did not have nightmares. The weeks that followed were both challenging and healing. Matthew threw himself into his new work with dedication, proving his worth to William Fletcher and the other ranch hands. Victoria established herself as capable and hardworking, helping the ranch cook with meal preparations, and taking on mending and alterations for the men who had no wives to do such things. Everyone at the Rising Sun accepted them as a married couple without question. Victoria wore a simple ring Matthew had purchased at a trading post along their journey, and they referred to each other as husband and wife. The deception troubled Victoria's conscience, but she understood its necessity. In this time and place, an unmarried woman traveling with a man would be shunned, and a married woman who had left her husband would be judged even more harshly. As her pregnancy advanced, Victoria bloomed in ways she never had at the Double C. Good food, adequate rest, and the absence of constant stress improved her health dramatically. The baby grew strong, kicking vigorously, and Victoria found herself excited about the birth rather than simply fearful. Matthew was attentive and tender, treating Victoria as though she was made of spun glass. He rubbed her aching back in the evenings, made sure she had enough to eat, and forbade her from lifting anything heavy. At night they lay together chastely, Matthew holding her but never pressing for more intimate relations. Finally, one evening in late July, Victoria gathered her courage and asked, Matthew, do you not want me? Physically, I mean. Matthew looked shocked. Of course I want you. Every moment of every day. Then why have you never touched me the way a husband touches his wife? Matthew's expression became pained. Because you are pregnant with another man's child, Victoria. Because you have spent months being used by a man who did not care about your pleasure or your pain. I will not add to that trauma by making demands on you. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. You think being intimate with you would be traumatic for me. I think you need time to heal, to feel safe, to understand that lovemaking should be about joy and connection rather than duty and submission. Matthew took her hand gently. I do not want our first time together to be while you are carrying Henry's baby. When I make love to you, truly make love to you, I want it to be a new beginning for both of us. I want you to come to me freely, without the shadow of him between us. Victoria understood what he was saying and loved him even more for his consideration. But she also felt a growing desire to be close to him, to experience physical intimacy that was based on love rather than obligation. What if I want that new beginning now? She asked softly. What if I want to reclaim my body by choosing who I give it to? Matthew's breath caught. Victoria, you are 7 months pregnant. And yet I still want you. Is that so strange? No, Matthew said hoarsely. It is not strange at all, but are you certain? I do not want you to feel pressured or rushed. In answer, Victoria leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss started gentle but quickly deepened, both of them pouring months of suppressed longing into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I am certain, Victoria whispered. I want to know what it feels like to be touched by someone who loves me. Please, Matthew, help me understand that intimacy does not have to be painful or cold. Matthew stood and pulled her gently to her feet, then led her to their bed. He undressed her slowly, reverently, pausing to kiss each new bit of skin revealed. When she was naked, he looked at her with such hunger and adoration that Victoria felt beautiful for the first time in her life, despite her swollen belly and the marks left by pregnancy. You are so lovely, Matthew breathed. Perfect. Then he showed her with actions what he meant with words. He explored her body with patient thoroughness, learning what made her gasp with pleasure, what made her arch into his touch. He was gentle with her pregnant belly, tender with her sensitive breasts, focused entirely on her enjoyment rather than his own. When he finally entered her, it was with aching slowness and constant attention to her comfort. Victoria had braced herself for pain, for the rough claiming she had come to expect from physical intimacy. Instead, Matthew moved with exquisite care, watching her face, adjusting his rhythm to match her responses. And for the first time in her life, Victoria understood what the other women had giggled about, what the romantic novels had hinted at. This was what lovemaking should be. A communion of souls expressed through joined bodies, pleasure that built and crested and left her breathless with wonder. Afterward, they lay tangled together, both deeply moved by what they had shared. Victoria cried, but these were tears of healing rather than pain. Matthew held her close, murmuring words of love and reassurance, and Victoria felt pieces of herself that had been broken begin to slowly mend. Thank you, she whispered against his chest, for showing me it could be beautiful. Always, Matthew promised. For as long as we both shall live, I will make sure you know you are cherished. The baby arrived in early September, on a morning when autumn was just beginning to touch the Montana mountains with gold and crimson. Victoria's labor was long and difficult, and there were hours when she feared she would die like Henry's first wife. But Matthew stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, encouraging her when she wanted to give up. The ranch cook, a capable woman named Martha who had assisted at many births, helped deliver a healthy baby boy just after dawn. Victoria wept when she heard his first lusty cry, overwhelmed with relief and love and exhaustion. Matthew cut the cord with shaking hands, then held the baby while Martha tended to Victoria. When he brought the infant to her, carefully placing him in her arms, his face was streaked with tears. "He is perfect," Matthew said in wonder. "Absolutely perfect." Victoria looked down at her son, at his tiny scrunched face and flailing fists, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world. What should we name him?" Matthew asked. Victoria had thought about this throughout her pregnancy. The child was legally Henry's, but Henry would never know him, would never have the chance to shape him into a cold, unfeeling replica. This boy would be raised with love and laughter, taught kindness and compassion. He deserved a name that reflected new beginnings. "Daniel," she said. "Daniel Fletcher Dawson. If that is all right with you." Matthew's eyes widened. "You want to give him my name? He is your son in every way that matters." "And I thought perhaps we could use Mr. Fletcher's name as well, to honor the man who gave us sanctuary. I would be proud to call him Daniel." Matthew leaned down and kissed first the baby's forehead, then Victoria's lips. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for trusting me with both of your lives." Over the following months, Victoria healed from the birth and adjusted to motherhood. Daniel proved to be a relatively easy baby, crying only when hungry or uncomfortable, sleeping well, and gazing at the world with alert curiosity. Matthew was a devoted father, taking turns walking with the baby at night, changing diapers without complaint, and spending every free moment simply holding his son. Victoria watched Matthew with Daniel and felt her love for him deepen into something eternal and unshakable. This man, who had no biological connection to the child, loved Daniel as fiercely as any father could. He sang him songs in the evening, told him stories even though he was too young to understand, and protected him with gentle vigilance. As winter approached, Victoria began to worry about their precarious situation. She and Matthew were living as husband and wife, but she was still legally married to Henry. Eventually, that fact would have to be addressed. She mentioned her concerns to Matthew one evening after Daniel was asleep. "I know," Matthew said quietly. "I have been thinking about it too. We need to find a lawyer, see what options are available. Divorce is difficult but not impossible. Especially if we can prove Henry was cruel or negligent. It will be expensive. I have been saving. And I am due for a raise once winter is over. We will figure it out, Victoria. I promise." But before they could take any steps toward legal resolution, their past caught up with them. It was late November, and Victoria was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. She turned to see a group of men on horseback, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the figure at the front. Henry Carmichael had found them. Victoria ran inside and scooped Daniel from his cradle, her heart hammering with terror. Matthew burst through the door seconds later, his face grim. "It is Henry," he said unnecessarily. "He has 4 men with him, including the sheriff from Fort Bridger. They are demanding that William Fletcher turn you over. What are we going to do?" "I am going to talk to them. You stay here with Daniel." Matthew pulled her close, kissing her fiercely. "No matter what happens, know that I love you, both of you." Then he was gone, striding toward the confrontation. Victoria crept to the window. Daniel clutched to her chest and watched the scene unfold. Henry sat on his horse, looking as cold and implacable as ever. The sheriff, a heavy-set man Victoria vaguely remembered from her brief time in Fort Bridger, was speaking with William Fletcher. Matthew approached and was immediately challenged by Henry. "There you are, Dawson. I should have known you were behind my wife's disappearance." Did you think you could steal another man's property and face no consequences? Victoria is not property, Matthew said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. She is a woman who was mistreated and fled to safety. She is my legal wife, and you are an adulterer and a kidnapper. Henry turned to the sheriff. Arrest him, and retrieve my wife and child. They are coming back to Wyoming with me. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Now, Mr. Carmichael, I am not sure I have jurisdiction here in Montana, and if the lady left of her own free will. She is a woman. Her will is irrelevant. The law gives me the right to my own wife. William Fletcher stepped forward. The lady and her husband have been living on my ranch for several months now. They are hard workers and have caused no trouble. I do not see any reason to disrupt their lives. Her husband. Henry's voice dripped with contempt. She is married to me, old man. This cowboy is just a thief with delusions. Victoria could not stand it any longer. She wrapped Daniel in a blanket and walked out to face Henry, her legs shaking but her spine straight. All the men turned to look at her, and she saw shock on Henry's face that she would dare to show herself. "Henry," she said, proud that her voice came out steady, "I am not returning to Wyoming with you. You do not have a choice." Henry dismounted and stalked toward her, and Victoria fought the urge to run. "You are my wife. That child is my son. Both of you are coming home where you belong. That child has a name, Daniel. And he belongs with people who love him, not with a man who sees him only as property and an heir." Victoria stood her ground as Henry came closer. "You never loved me, Henry. You never even tried. I was simply a replacement for the wife you lost, a servant you did not have to pay wages. You ungrateful woman. I gave you a home, food, security, and this is how you repay me. By running off with a common ranch hand and passing off my son as his. I never told anyone Daniel was not yours biologically," Victoria said. "But Matthew is his father in every way that matters. He loves Daniel. He loves me, which is more than you ever did or ever could." Henry's face flushed with anger. "You think love matters? You are a foolish child. Marriage is a contract, a practical arrangement. Love has nothing to do with it." "Perhaps that is why your first wife died," Victoria said, and the words came out hard and cruel. "Perhaps she simply gave up because life with you was not worth living." Henry's hand shot out and cracked across her face, the blow hard enough to make her stumble. Daniel started crying, frightened by the sudden movement and his mother's gasp of pain. Before Henry could strike again, Matthew was there, shoving himself between them, his eyes blazing with fury. "Touch her again and I will kill you," Matthew said, and the promise in his voice was absolute. The sheriff quickly stepped forward. "All right, that is enough. Mr. Carmichael, you cannot assault the lady, regardless of your legal relationship. She is my wife. I have the right to discipline her. Not like that, you do not." The sheriff turned to Victoria. "Madam, I need to understand the situation. Did this man kidnap you and force you to come to Montana?" "No," Victoria said clearly, shifting Daniel to her shoulder and patting his back to soothe him. "I left of my own free will. Matthew did not force me or coerce me. He offered me escape from an intolerable situation, and I accepted. The situation was only intolerable because you are weak and ungrateful," Henry spat. "I gave you everything, and you repaid me with betrayal and adultery. You gave me nothing but misery." Victoria's voice rose, months of suppressed anger finally breaking free. "You treated me like livestock from the moment I arrived. You never spoke a kind word to me, never showed the slightest consideration for my comfort or happiness. You used my body whenever you wanted without caring if I was willing or even conscious. You worked me until I nearly collapsed, even while I was pregnant with your child. And you never, not once, made me feel like I was anything more than a disappointing investment. The other men shifted uncomfortably, looking away. Even Henry's hired hand seemed troubled by Victoria's passionate testimony. The sheriff rubbed his face, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Madam," he said finally, "I sympathize with your situation. Truly I do, but the law is clear. A wife belongs to her husband until death or legal divorce. Mr. Carmichael has the right to take you back to Wyoming." "Over my dead body," Matthew said flatly. "Son, do not make me arrest you for threatening violence." "Then arrest me, because I will not let him take Victoria and Daniel. I would rather die than see them return to that life." William Fletcher cleared his throat. "Sheriff, if I may make a suggestion, perhaps Mr. Carmichael and the lady could discuss this situation more calmly, without threats or violence. Give them a few minutes to talk privately. Maybe they can reach some kind of arrangement that does not require legal intervention." Henry looked like he wanted to refuse, but the sheriff nodded. "That seems reasonable. Mr. Carmichael, would you be willing to speak with your wife alone?" "She is hardly likely to be honest without her lover present," Henry said snidely. "I will speak with you," Victoria said, "but only if Matthew can watch from a distance. I will not be alone with you after what just happened." The sheriff considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough. You two talk over there by the fence. Everyone else will stay here, but we will keep you in sight." Victoria walked to the fence line with Henry following. Daniel still clutched protectively in her arms. Matthew stood perhaps 20 feet away, tense and ready to intervene if needed. Once they were out of easy earshot, Henry turned to her with cold fury. "You have embarrassed me in front of my men, in front of an entire community. Do you have any idea the damage you have caused to my reputation?" "Your reputation?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "Henry, I nearly died from overwork and neglect. Your reputation is the least of my concerns. If you return now, I am willing to overlook this indiscretion. We will go back to Wyoming, you will resume your duties, and we will never speak of this again." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "You think I would ever willingly return to that life, after I have experienced what it means to be treated with kindness and respect? Henry, I would rather be poor and disgraced than wealthy and dead inside." "Then you are a fool." Henry's gaze dropped to Daniel, and something ugly crossed his face. "That child is my legal son. Even if you refuse to return, I can demand custody. A woman living in sin with her lover is not fit to raise my heir." Terror spiked through Victoria, sharp and nauseating. She had not considered that Henry might try to take Daniel while leaving her behind. "You would not. You have no interest in raising a child. Perhaps not. But I will not allow my son to be raised by another man, to carry another man's name and be taught to despise his true father." Henry's voice was cold and calculating. "So here is my offer. Return to Wyoming with me, resume your position as my wife, and I will allow you to keep the child. Refuse, and I will use every legal means at my disposal to take him from you. And I assure you, I have the resources and connections to do exactly that." Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She looked down at Daniel's perfect face, at his tiny features so innocent and trusting, and knew she could not risk losing him. But the thought of returning to Henry's house, to his bed, to that life of silent suffering, made her want to scream. "You are a monster," she whispered. "I am a man protecting what belongs to me. You have 1 minute to decide, Victoria. Come back willingly, or I begin legal proceedings to take the child." Victoria's mind raced desperately, seeking some way out, some solution that would let her keep Daniel without sacrificing herself. But she could see no escape. In 1883, the law overwhelmingly favored husbands and fathers. Henry could almost certainly make good on his threat, especially given his wealth and her current circumstances. She turned to look at Matthew, standing tense and watchful in the distance. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face that he understood what was happening, understood the choice she was being forced to make. The anguish there nearly broke her. "I need to speak with Matthew," Victoria said. "Give me that much at least." Henry hesitated, then nodded curtly. 5 minutes. "But if you try to run, I will hunt you down. And I will take that baby regardless of what you want." Victoria walked on shaking legs to where Matthew waited. As soon as she was close enough, he pulled her into his arms, Daniel cradled between them. "He is going to take Daniel if I do not go back with him," Victoria said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He can do it, Matthew. The law will support him. A father's rights to his child supersede almost everything else. Then we will fight him in court. We will find the best lawyer in Montana, maybe even bring in someone from back east. We will prove you are a fit mother and that Henry is unfit to raise a child. With what money? With what evidence? Henry has resources we cannot match. And even if we could win eventually, what happens to Daniel in the meantime? Henry could take him tomorrow and keep him for months or years while the case drags through courts." Victoria pressed her face against Matthew's chest, inhaling his familiar scent, trying to memorize everything about this moment. "I cannot risk it. I cannot risk losing Daniel. So you are going to sacrifice yourself. Return to a man who treats you like property?" Matthew's voice was anguished. "Victoria, there has to be another way. If there is, I cannot see it." She pulled back far enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Matthew. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. But I am a mother now and I have to protect my child." "He is my child too," Matthew said desperately. "In my heart, he is my son. I know, and that makes this so much harder." Victoria rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into the connection. Love, grief, regret, gratitude. When she pulled back, they were both crying. "I need you to promise me something, anything. Do not follow us. Do not try to rescue me again. It will only make things worse for everyone, and Henry will make sure you are arrested or worse." Victoria handed Daniel to him, needing both hands free to frame Matthew's face. "Remember that I love you. Remember that this time with you was the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me. And maybe someday, if things change, if circumstances allow, we will find our way back to each other. But for now, I need you to let me go. I cannot. Victoria, I cannot just watch you walk away with him. You have to, for Daniel's sake, if nothing else. Please, Matthew. Be strong enough to let me do what I must." Daniel started fussing, and Victoria took him back, cuddling him close and breathing in his sweet baby smell. She looked at his face, memorizing every detail, knowing these might be the last moments of happiness she would know for a long time. "I am so sorry," she whispered to her son. "I wanted so much better for you than this. But I promise, no matter what happens, I will love you and protect you with everything I have. You will grow up knowing you are cherished, even if I have to do it in a house without love." She kissed Daniel's forehead, then turned to walk back to Henry. Each step felt like a small death, like she was walking toward her own execution. Behind her, she could hear Matthew making a sound like a wounded animal, and it took every ounce of willpower not to turn back. Henry was waiting with grim satisfaction. "A wise choice. Let us go before you change your mind." "I want one thing in writing first," Victoria said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "You will not mistreat me physically. You will allow me to care for Daniel without interference. And you will permit me to write letters to my friend Martha here at the Rising Sun, so someone knows I am alive and well. You are not in a position to negotiate. If you want me to come willingly and quietly, without making a scene that will embarrass you further, you will agree to these terms. The sheriff can witness the agreement." Henry's jaw clenched, but he nodded. The sheriff was called over, and a hasty document was drafted outlining Victoria's conditions. Henry signed it with obvious reluctance, and the sheriff witnessed the signature. It was not much protection, but it was something. "Now get in the wagon," Henry ordered. "We have a long journey ahead of us." Victoria climbed into the wagon bed, settling Daniel in her lap. She refused to look at Matthew, knowing that seeing his face would shatter her fragile composure. As Henry took the reins and the wagon lurched into motion, Victoria finally allowed herself one glance back. Matthew stood frozen where she had left him, his face a mask of devastation. Their eyes met across the increasing distance, and Victoria saw in his expression a promise. He would not stop fighting for her, would not stop hoping, would not stop loving her no matter how much time passed. Then the wagon turned a corner, and Matthew was lost from view. Victoria held Daniel tight and wept silently as they traveled back toward a life she had briefly, beautifully escaped. The journey back to Wyoming was endless and miserable. Henry barely spoke to her except to issue curt orders. His hired men treated her with a mixture of pity and discomfort, clearly uneasy with the situation but unwilling to contradict their employer. Victoria focused all her attention on Daniel, caring for him as best she could under difficult circumstances. When they finally arrived back at the Double C Ranch, Mrs. Patterson greeted them with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you are safe, dear. We were all so worried." Victoria wanted to laugh at the idea that anyone had truly been worried about her welfare rather than Henry's property. But she simply nodded and allowed herself to be ushered into the house. Everything was exactly as she had left it, as though the past months had never happened. That night, Henry summoned her to his bedroom. Victoria went with leaden feet, Daniel asleep in the cradle that had been brought in from storage. Henry closed the door and turned to face her, his expression hard. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "I retrieved you because you belong to me, not because I have any affection for you. You will resume your duties exactly as before. The only difference is that now I know you are capable of betrayal, and I will be watching you constantly. If you ever try to leave again, I will take that child and you will never see him again. Do you understand?" "Yes," Victoria whispered. "Good. Now undress. I have been without my wife for months, and I intend to reclaim what is mine." Victoria obeyed mechanically, hating every second, hating herself for being weak enough to return. But when Henry took her, rough and quick and indifferent to her pain, she closed her eyes and thought of gray-blue eyes and gentle hands and a love that had been real, however brief. The weeks that followed were worse than her original time at the ranch. Henry watched her constantly, suspicious of every interaction, every moment out of his sight. He forbade her from having any contact with Martha or anyone at the Rising Sun Ranch. Her letters, when she was permitted to write them, were read and approved by Henry before being sent. The only bright spot in Victoria's existence was Daniel. She poured all her love and attention into her son, determined that he would at least grow up knowing he was cherished. She sang to him, played with him, told him stories about a brave cowboy who had loved them both so much he let them go to keep them safe. As Daniel grew from infant to baby to toddler, Victoria saw traces of Matthew in him that had nothing to do with biology. The gentleness with which he treated animals, the way he watched the world with curious, observant eyes, the quick smile that could light up a room. Henry noticed too, and his resentment grew. "You are ruining that boy," Henry complained when Daniel was 2 years old. "He is too soft, too gentle. He needs to be toughened up if he is going to run this ranch someday." "He is a child," Victoria said quietly. "He has time to grow. He has your weakness. I can see it already." Henry's gaze was cold and assessing. Perhaps it was a mistake to let you raise him. Perhaps he needs a firmer hand. Fear shot through Victoria. I am his mother. I know what he needs. Do you? Or are you just passing along your own cowardice and sentimentality? Henry stood and headed for the door. I will be taking a more active role in the boy's education from now on. It is time he learned to be a man. After that, Henry began removing Daniel from Victoria's care for hours at a time, taking him out to the barns and corrals, forcing him to watch as cattle were branded or horses broken, expecting a toddler to absorb lessons in dominance and control. Daniel would return to Victoria tearful and clingy, confused by his father's harshness. Victoria did her best to counteract Henry's influence, to show Daniel that strength could coexist with kindness, that being gentle was not the same as being weak. But she knew she was fighting a losing battle. As Daniel grew, he would spend more and more time with Henry, learning to mirror his father's cold pragmatism. 3 years passed. Then 4. Victoria felt herself aging rapidly, worn down by endless work and constant vigilance. She had no friends, no allies, no one to confide in. Her only solace was her son, and even that was being slowly taken from her as Henry shaped Daniel into his own image. On a cold January morning in 1888, when Daniel was 4 years old and Victoria was 28 but felt 50, she was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Mrs. Patterson entered with an envelope. "This came for you," the housekeeper said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure Henry was not nearby. "It is from that ranch in Montana. Mr. Carmichael does not know about it yet. I thought you might want to read it first." Victoria's hands shook as she took the envelope. She recognized the handwriting immediately, Matthew's careful script, addressing her as Mrs. Henry Carmichael but with her name underlined twice. She tucked the letter into her dress and waited until she had a moment alone to open it. Matthew's letter was carefully worded, written as though from an old friend rather than a lover, in case Henry read it. But between the lines, Victoria could feel Matthew's continued devotion, his concern for her welfare, his hope that circumstances might someday change. He told her about his life at the Rising Sun Ranch, how he had been promoted to foreman, how he had saved enough money to purchase a small piece of land where he hoped to eventually build a house. He mentioned Martha and William Fletcher, who both sent their regards. And at the end he had written, "I think of you every day and hope that you and your son are well. If you ever need anything at all, please do not hesitate to reach out. Some promises do not expire with time." Victoria pressed the letter to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Matthew had not forgotten her. After 4 years, he still loved her, still waited. The knowledge was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what she had lost, what she might have had if circumstances had been different. She hid the letter in the lining of her sewing basket, where Henry would never think to look. And that night, as she lay awake beside her sleeping husband, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, a different future. Perhaps someday, when Daniel was older and less dependent on her, when Henry had finally drunk himself to death or been killed in a ranch accident, she could be free. Perhaps there was still hope, however faint. The letter from Matthew became a talisman, a secret source of strength. Victoria reread it so often she memorized every word. And slowly, carefully, she began to write back, crafting letters that could pass Henry's scrutiny while still conveying the depth of her feelings to the one person who truly understood her. 2 more years passed. Daniel turned 6, and Henry insisted he begin helping with ranch work in earnest. Victoria watched her son transform gradually, losing some of his natural sweetness, learning to hide his emotions the way his father did. It broke her heart, but she did not know how to stop it. Then, in the spring of 1890, everything changed. Henry had been experiencing chest pains for several weeks, but he refused to see a doctor, insisting it was just indigestion from Mrs. Patterson's cooking. One morning in late April, he came down to breakfast, sat at the table, and simply collapsed. Victoria ran to him, checking for breath or pulse, but there was nothing. Henry Carmichael was dead at 53 years old, his heart finally giving out after years of stress and stubbornness. The funeral was well attended, as Henry had been a prominent member of the community. People expressed condolences to Victoria with varying degrees of sincerity, most of them clearly wondering what the young widow would do now. She stood through it all with Daniel at her side, numb with shock and relief, and guilt over feeling relieved. After the funeral, Henry's lawyer explained that the ranch and all its assets had been left to Daniel, with Victoria serving as guardian and manager until the boy came of age. She would have full control over the property and the finances, answerable to no one. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria was free. She waited a respectful period of 6 months before she made any major decisions. She hired a competent foreman to run the ranch operations, ensured Daniel was being properly educated, and slowly began to plan for a future she had thought was impossible. In late October, Victoria packed a small bag, left Daniel in Mrs. Patterson's capable care with instructions she would return in a week, and boarded a train heading north to Montana. The journey took 3 days, and with each passing mile, Victoria felt years of tension and fear falling away. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled into the night, nor the defeated woman who had returned in chains. She was Victoria Zimmerman Carmichael, widow, mother, property owner, and most importantly, a woman with choices. The Rising Sun Ranch looked exactly as she remembered, though everything seemed smaller somehow, less overwhelming. Victoria hired a buggy in town and drove herself to the property, her heart hammering with anticipation and nervousness. William Fletcher greeted her warmly, his face breaking into a huge smile when he recognized her. "Mrs. Carmichael, what a wonderful surprise. How are you? How is your boy?" "We are well, thank you. Daniel is growing like a weed." Victoria glanced around the yard. "Is Matthew Dawson still working here?" "He is indeed, though he lives on his own property now, about 5 miles north. Built himself a fine house and is running a small herd. He still works for me part-time, helps with the horses mostly." William's expression became knowing. "Should I send someone to fetch him? If it is not too much trouble." Victoria waited in William's parlor, drinking tea with Martha and catching up on the past 6 years. When she finally heard horses approaching, her heart began to race. She stood and walked to the door, stepping out onto the porch just as Matthew dismounted. He looked the same, perhaps a little older, a few more lines around his eyes. But when he saw her, his face transformed with such joy and hope that Victoria started to cry. She walked down the steps, and Matthew met her halfway, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of years of longing. "Victoria," he breathed into her hair. "You came back." "He is dead," Victoria said, the words both simple and profound. "Henry died 6 months ago." "I am free, Matthew. I am finally free." Matthew pulled back to look at her face, his hands framing her cheeks. "Truly, truly. The ranch is mine in trust for Daniel. I can do what I want, go where I want, and what I want is you, if you will still have me after all this time." "If I will still have you," Matthew laughed, the sound rough with emotion. "Victoria, I have been waiting for you for 6 years. I have not looked at another woman, have not considered any other future. You are the only one I want, the only one I will ever want." Then he kissed her, and it was like coming home after a long exile. Victoria melted into him, into the kiss, into the promise of a future they had both believed was impossible. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing simultaneously. Matthew kept touching her face, her hair, as though to reassure himself she was real. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Victoria smiled through her tears. "Now we do what we should have done from the beginning. We get married properly and legally. We build a life together. We raise Daniel to be the kind, gentle man I know he can be if he has the right example. We finally get our happily ever after. And the ranch in Wyoming, I will hire someone to manage it, or perhaps sell it eventually, but I am not going back there to live, Matthew. Too many bad memories. My future is here with you." Matthew's arms tightened around her. "I love you, Victoria. I have loved you since the moment I saw you step off that train, frightened and brave and beautiful. I will love you until the day I die. And I love you. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You taught me what love is supposed to look like, what it is supposed to feel like. And you waited for me, even when there was no reason to hope." They stood together on the porch of the Rising Sun Ranch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And Victoria felt something she had not experienced in far too long. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. 3 weeks later, Victoria and Matthew were married in a small ceremony at the church in town. Daniel served as ring bearer, proud and excited to see his mother happy for the first time in his memory. Martha and William Fletcher stood as witnesses, and the few people in attendance were moved by the obvious devotion between bride and groom. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed Victoria with reverent tenderness, and she felt truly married for the first time in her life. This was what marriage was supposed to be. A partnership based on love and respect, a commitment freely given by both parties, a joining of hearts as well as lives. They moved into Matthew's house, which was modest but comfortable, and began building their life together. Daniel adapted quickly, blooming under Matthew's patient guidance and obvious affection. Matthew taught the boy to ride and rope, to care for animals with compassion, to work hard while also making time for joy and play. Victoria watched her son rediscover his natural gentleness, his quick smile, his curiosity about the world. In the evenings, after Daniel was asleep, Victoria and Matthew would sit together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Sometimes they talked about the past, processing their shared trauma and celebrating their survival. Sometimes they planned for the future, dreaming of the family they would build, the life they would create. And sometimes they simply held each other in comfortable silence, grateful beyond measure for the second chance they had been given. In the summer of 1891, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. The news filled them both with joy and some trepidation, as her last pregnancy had been so difficult. But this time was different. With proper care and adequate rest, with a partner who treated her as precious rather than expendable, Victoria's pregnancy progressed smoothly. Their daughter was born the following February, arriving just as the first signs of spring appeared in the mountains. She had Matthew's gray-blue eyes and Victoria's dark hair, and they named her Grace, because that was what their entire story had been. An unexpected gift of grace when both had been at their lowest points. Daniel adored his baby sister, hovering over her cradle and demanding to help with her care. Matthew would hold Grace for hours, singing to her softly, his face filled with wonder that this perfect creature was his. And Victoria, watching her husband with their daughter and stepson, felt her heart so full she thought it might burst. The years that followed were not without challenges. Running a ranch was hard work, money was sometimes tight, and the Montana winters could be brutal. But Victoria and Matthew faced every obstacle together, as partners and equals. They built a marriage based on communication and compromise, on passion and tenderness, on laughter and mutual respect. Daniel grew into a fine young man, kind and capable, eventually taking over management of the Wyoming ranch when he came of age. Grace proved to be spirited and intelligent, inheriting her mother's determination and her father's steady strength. The family expanded to include 2 more children, a boy they named Samuel and a girl they called Rose. Through it all, Victoria never forgot how close she had come to losing everything. She never took for granted the love she shared with Matthew, the family they had created, the life they had built from the ashes of despair. Every morning, she woke grateful for another day with this man who had rescued her, who had waited for her, who had loved her with a devotion that transcended circumstance and convention. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Matthew took Victoria back to the crossroads where she had met him that dawn so long ago. They stood in the early morning light, holding hands, remembering that desperate flight toward freedom. "I would do it all again," Victoria said softly. "Every hard moment, every painful decision, it was all worth it to end up here with you." Matthew brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You are the bravest person I have ever known. You risked everything for a chance at happiness, and you never gave up hope even in the darkest times. I am honored to be your husband, Victoria. I will be honored until my last breath." They kissed as the sun rose over the Montana plains. 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built a love strong enough to weather any storm. And in that moment, Victoria understood that this was the true meaning of romance. Not the easy love of fairy tales, but the hard-won love forged in the fires of adversity, tested by time and emerging stronger than steel. As they walked back to their horses, hand in hand, Victoria thought about that frightened girl who had stepped off a train in Wyoming all those years ago. She thought about the timid bride who had married a cold stranger, who had endured months of misery, who had found the courage to run toward an uncertain future. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, who understood the value of love freely given, who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is trusting someone enough to be vulnerable with them. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Victoria smiled up at him, this man who had whispered all those years ago that he would wait until she was ready to trust him, and who had kept that promise through years of separation and hardship. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am the luckiest woman alive, and that sometimes the train brings exactly what you need, even if it takes a long and winding road to get there." They rode home together as the morning light grew stronger, back to the house filled with children and laughter and love, back to the life they had created through faith and perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to each other. And Victoria knew with absolute certainty that this was her happily ever after, not perfect but real, not easy but infinitely precious. The years continued to pass, marked by both joys and sorrows as all lives must be. Daniel married a kind woman named Sarah and gave them 3 grandchildren. Grace became a teacher, dedicating herself to educating the children of frontier families. Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a respected rancher, and Rose surprised everyone by moving to San Francisco to study medicine, one of the first women in Montana to pursue such a path. Matthew and Victoria grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching sunsets paint the sky, holding hands with fingers gnarled by age and work, but still fitting together perfectly. They told their grandchildren stories about the old days, about trains and cowboys and the courage it takes to choose love over security. When Matthew died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, with Victoria holding his hand, she mourned deeply, but without regret. They had been given 40 wonderful years together, 40 years of partnership and passion and profound connection. It was more than many people ever received, and she was grateful for every moment. Victoria lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her fiercely. She spent those years writing down her story, wanting future generations to understand that sometimes the greatest romance is not the one that comes easily, but the one you fight for, the one you sacrifice for, the one you build with determination and hope and stubborn faith. On a spring morning very much like the one when Grace had been born, Victoria passed away quietly, a small smile on her face, her last thought of gray-blue eyes and a voice promising to wait until she was ready to trust him. Her family buried her next to Matthew, on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the endless Montana sky that had witnessed their entire journey. And if you visited that hillside today, you would find 2 headstones standing side by side, weathered by time but still bearing a clear inscription. Victoria and Matthew Dawson, they chose love. Because in the end, that was what their story had always been about. Not about the hardships they endured or the obstacles they overcame, but about 2 people who found each other in the wilderness, who recognized something precious and fought to protect it, who built a love that transcended convention and lasted beyond death. The train had brought a timid bride to Wyoming all those years ago, frightened and desperate and hoping for a fresh start. The cowboy had whispered that he would wait until she was ready to trust him, and he had kept that promise with a devotion that became the foundation of their entire life together. And in doing so, they had created something rare and beautiful, a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of courage and compassion and unwavering commitment. Their descendants still tell the story, passing it down through generations like a treasured heirloom. They speak of great-grandmother Victoria, who had the strength to leave everything behind in pursuit of happiness, and great-grandfather Matthew, who loved her with a patience and tenderness that changed the course of multiple lives. They remember the lesson at the heart of the tale, that true love is not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone willing to fight for you, to wait for you, to see you as you truly are and choose you anyway. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blows down from the mountains, people swear they can see 2 figures walking hand in hand across the hills, a man and a woman who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and refused to let go, even when the whole world tried to tear them apart. They are just shadows, just memories, just the lingering echo of a love that was strong enough to leave its mark on the very landscape. But those who believe in the enduring power of devotion know the truth, that some loves are so profound, so essential that they become eternal, woven into the fabric of the place where they flourished. The train had brought a timid bride. The cowboy had whispered his promise. And together, they had created a legacy that would outlast them both. Proof that even in the hardest of times, even in the harshest of places, love can bloom and thrive and transform everything it touches. Their story became the bedrock upon which their family was built, a reminder that courage comes in many forms, that patience is its own kind of strength, and that sometimes the greatest adventure is simply learning to trust another person with your whole heart. Victoria and Matthew Dawson had lived and loved and built something beautiful from the ruins of despair. And that, in the end, was the most romantic story of all. Not a fairy tale, but something better, something real, something that proved love is always worth fighting for, waiting for, and believing in, no matter how impossible it might seem. Their love had been tested by fire and emerged as gold, refined and pure and infinitely precious. And the light of that love continued to shine through the generations, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost or trapped or hopeless, a promise that happiness is possible, that redemption is real, and that sometimes, if you are very lucky and very brave, the train brings exactly what you need, a chance at the love you deserve.